My name is Claudia Jalisco, and the woman I once was, a history professor who believed in goodness and justice, died a long time ago. Before I delve into the ashes of my life and show you how pain can be forged into a weapon, I need to ask something of you. This is not an easy story to tell, and sharing it is all I have left. If this narrative resonates with your soul, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. We have a goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers so that voices like mine are not lost in the silence. Please also comment with where you are listening from, so I know I am not alone in this darkness. Your presence here gives me the strength to continue, to ensure that what happened to me is never forgotten, and that my journey serves as a warning. I lived in Puerto de Sombras, a city that breathed both hope and fear. My life was a mosaic of small joys. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of my daughter's laughter echoing through the house, and the safe embrace of my husband, an investigative journalist who believed that truth was the only light capable of dispelling the shadows. We were a team, driven by an idealism that I now realize was dangerously naive. We believed in the power of the community, in the strength of words, and in the integrity of the system. We built our home as a fortress of love and principles, a place where the evil of the outside world seemed distant, a muffled noise that could never break through our walls and touch our happiness. My daughter at 16 was the embodiment of all our dreams. She had my passion for history and her father's courage to question the world. Her notebooks were filled with poems about justice, and her eyes shone with the promise of a bright future. She was our masterpiece, the reason we fought for a better city. Every sacrifice, every extra hour of work, every dangerous article my husband wrote, it was all to pave a safe path for her. I remember her delicate hands turning the pages of books, her voice telling me about her plans to become a lawyer to defend the innocent. She was living proof that goodness still existed, a beacon of purity in a world that was already beginning to darken around us. Puerto de Sombras, however, had an invisible master, the Los Lobos cartel. They were a cancer that spread slowly, infiltrating every corner, every business, every police station. Their claws tightened around the city's throat, and everyone knew it. But fear was an effective silencer. My husband, in his tireless search for the truth, decided to expose one of their extortion rackets. He believed that by shining a light on their activities, justice would prevail. He spent months investigating, gathering testimonies, building a solid case. I supported him, though a seed of dread had already begun to sprout in my heart. I saw the shadow in people's eyes on the street, the heavy silence when the cartel's name was mentioned. We were challenging a monster, armed only with words. As a community activist, I organized meetings, promoted education, and encouraged young people not to give in to a life of crime. My voice was known, respected. I would stand on makeshift stages, the sun on my face, and speak of a future where our children wouldn't have to be afraid to walk the streets. I believed every word I said. I was the personification of peaceful resistance, the proof that the pen could be mightier than the sword. People listened to me, nodded their heads, and for a brief moment, we all felt that change was possible. That public image of strength and hope is now a faded photograph of a woman who no longer exists, a stranger whose ideals were brutally turned to dust. Today, the woman speaking to you is no longer that idealistic professor. I am a strategist, forged in the purest, coldest fury. The pain did not break me, it petrified me. It turned my blood to ice and my heart to a whetstone. I look in the mirror and see the features of the old Claudia, but her eyes are empty. They have been replaced by a frigid, focused, and relentless glint. I learned to smile in public, to shake the hands of powerful men, to speak with a calculated passion that hides the abyss I carry inside. I became a predator dressed in sheep's clothing, moving silently through the corridors of power, a place I once fought against and now use as my private hunting ground. The grief that initially consumed me gave way to a singular and frighteningly clear purpose. The system my husband fought and died for not only failed us, but it also protected his murderers. Justice wasn't blind. She was blindfolded and gagged by corruption. In that moment of terrible clarity, I understood that if I wanted justice, I would have to carve it out of the world with my own two hands. My pain would no longer be an open wound, but the fuel for my revenge. Every tear I shed solidified into a step on the ladder I would build to reach and destroy, one by one, the 7 men who took everything from me. The love for my family transformed into a precise, surgical, and patient hatred. My journey, therefore, is not one of redemption, but of retribution. I abandoned hope for a better world and came to believe only in the certainty of revenge. The history professor died that night, along with her family. In her place, an architect of fear was born, a silent reaper who would use the city's own corrupt structure as her weapon. I would become what they would never expect, an enemy infiltrated in their midst, an ordinary woman with an extraordinary determination to ensure that the monsters who walk freely through Puerta de Sombras would face a kind of justice that comes not from the courts, but from the darkness they themselves created. This is the story of how I made them pay. The night it all ended began with the publication of my husband's article. The headline, brave and incisive, was emblazoned on the front page of the local newspaper, exposing the Los Lobos extortion ring. For a brief moment, we felt a wave of pride, the feeling of having lit a candle in the darkness, but the flame attracted the worst kind of moths. In the hours that followed, the air in Puerta de Sombras grew heavy, dense. The phone fell silent, and neighbors who once greeted us now averted their gaze. An anonymous envelope was left on our doorstep containing only a photograph of our house, taken from a distance. There was no message, but the warning was clear. The monster my husband had poked was awake, and its eyes were fixed on us. Hope was quickly swallowed by a chilling, paralyzing premonition. The sound of the front door shattering was the soundtrack to the end of my world. 4 figures dressed in black, moving with brutal efficiency, invaded our sanctuary. Their faces were covered, but their eyes shone with an inhuman coldness. One of them, whose silence was more terrifying than any scream, was the leader. I would later learn his name. El Sombra. I was thrown to the floor, my face pressed against the cold tile, forced to watch the nightmare unfold. They didn't come to steal, they came to annihilate. My husband's words, which were meant to be his greatest weapon, became our family's death sentence. I saw the terror in my daughter's eyes and the helpless fury on my husband's face before the darkness took them forever. They left me alive, a punishment crueler than death. They left me to drown in the deafening silence that followed, a silence punctuated only by the dripping of a faucet and the sound of my own ragged breath. Hours later, as the first ray of sun illuminated the carnage, a young detective named Miguel walked in. His eyes reflected a genuine horror, but he was just one cog in a corrupt machine. The forensic work was cursory, the questions mechanical. My tragedy was recorded on a form, coded and filed away. I was a survivor, but also an eyewitness to something the entire city was determined to forget. I saw in the tired eyes of the officers that justice wasn't a pursuit, but an inconvenience they preferred to avoid. The following weeks were a bureaucratic torture. The investigation stalled. Crucial evidence went missing, and the official story that began to circulate was that of a settling of scores between rival factions, a blatant lie to absolve the true culprits and close the case. Every visit to the police station was a new blow, another layer of concrete on the coffin of my faith in the system. The men who destroyed my life continued to walk, free, protected by the very structure that was supposed to protect me. I was alone, screaming in a soundproof room. The pain of grief was immense, but the rage born from that impunity was a force of nature, a storm gathering at the epicenter of my shattered soul. It was in the cemetery, standing before two cold headstones, that the woman I used to be took her last breath. The tears dried up, and in their place, a sharp clarity emerged. Crying wouldn't bring my family back. Waiting for justice was like waiting for rain in the desert. There, on the earth that covered everything I loved, I made a decision. If the system wouldn't punish the guilty, I would become the system. If the law protected the monsters, I would become the law. It was in that exact moment, at that turning point, that my true story began. And that is why I ask for your subscription. Every new name that joins this channel is a reminder that I am not alone in this fight to bring the truth, no matter how dark, to light. Your help allows me to continue. After the decision in the cemetery, I disappeared. I sold the house, a reliquary of memories now desecrated, and used a lifetime of savings to erase myself from the world. I moved to an anonymous city hundreds of miles away, where no one knew my face or my pain. This exile was not for healing, but for forging. In a small, impersonal apartment, surrounded by books on political strategy, criminal law, and behavioral psychology, I began to build my new identity. The weeping professor was buried under layers of disciplined study and a hatred that burned on a low, constant flame. I did not allow sadness to overcome me. Every pang of pain was channeled into my purpose, turning into another hour of study, another page of notes on my enemies. My transformation was both internal and external. I cut my long hair, replaced my floral dresses with sober, impeccably tailored suits. I practiced a new posture in front of the mirror, upright and confident, eliminating any trace of vulnerability. The hardest part was learning to smile again. I spent hours exercising the muscles in my face, creating a mask of friendliness and warmth I did not feel. My smile became my sharpest weapon, a tool to disarm, to charm, to hide the icy void that had taken up residence in my chest. I was becoming an actress, and the role of a lifetime would be that of Claudia Jalisco, the public figure. A woman the people of Puerto de Sombras would believe was fighting for them, never suspecting who she was truly fighting. During this time, the list took shape. 7 names written in a black-covered notebook, each associated with a face that haunted my nightmares. Using my savings, I discreetly hired private investigators and used the dark web to buy information. I began to map the structure of Los Lobos, identifying each of the men responsible for my family's death. From the driver who waited in the car to the mastermind who gave the order, each name was a stepping stone. I studied their lives, their routines, their vices, their weaknesses. My grief transformed into a meticulous obsession. I was no longer a victim. I was a hunter, and that notebook became my holy Bible, a gospel of retribution written in the ink of my pain. 2 years later, I returned to Puerto de Sombras. The city was the same, suffocated under the same blanket of fear, but I was different. I announced my candidacy for city councilwoman in a modest press conference. My platform was simple and powerful: justice and safety for Puerto de Sombras. I used my own tragedy in an edited and controlled manner as proof of my commitment. I spoke of loss, of the system's failure, of the need for someone who understood the people's pain. Many saw admirable courage, a widow who turned her grief into a fight. No one saw the truth, that my quest for public office was not to serve the city, but to gain access, to place myself at the center of the web and begin cutting the threads, one by one. My campaign was an exercise in masterful manipulation. My speeches, written with the blood of my broken heart, resonated with an authenticity that no other politician could match. I didn't have to feign the pain in my voice when I spoke of the victims of violence. I channeled the image of my daughter, of my husband, and the words came out with the force of a hurricane. The people, desperate for a hero, for someone to finally stand up to the cartel, embraced my cause. They saw me as a symbol of resilience. Little did they know that my resilience came not from hope, but from a desire for revenge so profound it had consumed everything else in me. They voted for an angel of justice, not knowing they were electing an angel of death. The election victory brought no joy, only the cold satisfaction of a successful plan. From my new office at City Hall, I had a privileged view of the system. The same doors that had once been closed to me now opened with a smile. I was the Honorable Councilwoman Jalisco. This position gave me access to a treasure trove of information, public records, previously confidential police files, city blueprints, financial information. With my public servant mask, I requested documents under the pretext of urban security projects or corruption investigations, when in fact I was assembling the puzzle of my revenge. The bureaucracy that once blocked me had now become my most powerful ally. Finally, I isolated the first name on the list, a low-level enforcer named Ramirez. He was the man who had held my arms, his face twisted with cruelty inches from mine. Through the medical records I obtained from a contact in the public health system, I discovered his weak point. He was a type 1 diabetic, dependent on insulin. An error in dosage could be fatal and easily dismissed as an accident. The hunt had begun. I spent weeks observing his routine, his route to the clinic, his schedule. Every step was planned with surgical precision. The fear and hesitation I expected to feel never came. In their place, there was only a cold focus, a terrifying calm. The execution was impersonal, clinical. I bribed an indebted nurse, a desperate woman who asked no questions. A significant sum of money was transferred to an offshore account in exchange for a small favor, swapping a patient's insulin vial with one I had provided, containing a massive, lethal dose. I was miles away when it happened, sitting in a city council meeting, debating the allocation of funds for public parks. I heard the news of his death on the car radio on my way home. The announcer stated that Ramirez had died due to complications from his medical condition. It was the first domino to fall, and the sound of its fall was the first note in a dark symphony that only I could hear. That night, as I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of my apartment window, I did not recognize the woman staring back. The professor who believed in the sanctity of life had orchestrated a man's death. There was no triumph, only a deep emptiness, and the chilling confirmation that I had crossed a moral threshold with no return. What have I become? This question echoes within me every day. I know many of you might judge me, and perhaps rightly so, but to understand the path I have walked, you must feel the weight of my loss. If you are still with me, if you still seek to understand, I ask you to remain subscribed. Your presence reminds me that my story, however terrible, must be told to the end. Detective Miguel, now older and more cynical, read the report on Ramirez's death. To everyone else, it was a closed case, but to him, something felt wrong. He remembered Ramirez's name from my case file, a forgotten footnote. A coincidence, perhaps, but experience had taught him that coincidences were rare in Puerto de Sombras. He had no proof, only a gut feeling, a loose thread that his inquisitive mind couldn't help but pull. Quietly, without an official warrant, he began to re-examine the enforcer's death and, by extension, to revisit the massacre of my family, not knowing that his investigation would set him on a collision course with the same twisted justice he sought. My next target was more complex. A corrupt police officer, Sergeant Silva, the man who ensured the investigation into my family's death, was buried. Eliminating him would require more than a simple medical manipulation. It would require me to use the cartel's own cruelty against one of its protectors. He was the bridge between the law and crime, and I planned to burn that bridge with him on it. The challenge stimulated me. The complexity of the task kept the ghosts that haunted me in the silent hours of the night at bay. Planning became my refuge, the architecture of revenge the only thing that made me feel alive, or something like it. Using documents I obtained from my office, I forged a paper trail that suggested Sergeant Silver was skimming money from the cartel. A fake bank. Statement here, an anonymous email with compromising information there. I planted the seed of distrust in the fertile soil of organized crime's paranoia. I knew that for Los Lobos, betrayal was a capital sin, punishable in only one way. I wouldn't have to lift a finger against Silver. I just aimed the cartel's fury in his direction and waited. It was a dangerous game. If I made a mistake, the same fury would turn on me, but the risk seemed insignificant compared to the need to see another name. Crossed off my list. A week later, Sergeant Silver's body was found in his car, with 2 bullets in the back of his head, the cartel's classic method for dealing with traitors. The news spread like wildfire, and the official narrative was the one I had created. A corrupt cop who got too greedy. Within the Los Lobos organization, my maneuver sowed chaos and suspicion. They didn't know the threat wasn't coming from within, but from a woman sitting in a city hall office reading reports on the incident with a look of grave concern on her public face. Silver's death was a double victory. Another person responsible eliminated, and the internal structure of my enemy shaken by distrust. However, the deaths did not go unnoticed by El Sombra. He was an intelligent predator, not a mere enforcer. Ramirez's medical complication, followed by the sudden settling of scores with Silver, was a pattern that bothered him. He knew something was wrong, that an invisible hand was moving the pieces on. The board. His loyalty to the cartel was absolute, but his survival depended on his ability to sniff out threats. He began his own parallel investigation, discreet and brutal, using his own methods to extract information on the streets. The hunt had become mutual. Without knowing it, I had awakened the monster I most wanted to destroy, and he was now starting to look for me. It was during this period of high tension that my sister, Eleanor, came to visit. She was my only remaining link to the past, to the woman I had been. Her presence in my sterile apartment was like a flower growing through concrete. She looked at me with concern, noticing the coldness in my eyes, the absence of any genuine joy in my smile. "You seem so distant, Claudia," she said, her voice full of a tenderness that almost broke my defenses. Her visits were a torment, a mirror that forced me to see the chasm between the sister she loved and the calculating spectre I had become. She was my conscience, and I pushed her away so I wouldn't drown in guilt. The next 2 targets were brothers, known for their brutality and their gambling addiction. Crossing their names off the list required a different approach. I delved into the underworld of Puerta de Sombras, using a disguise to frequent the same illegal gambling dens they did. With inside information on the cartel's finances, I manipulated a high-stakes poker game. I planted the idea that one brother was cheating the other, fueling the greed and mistrust that already existed between them. The bait worked perfectly. The dispute, which began with heated accusations at the card table, ended in a dark alley, with both of them dead, victims of their own avarice and paranoia. Meanwhile, Detective Miguel's quiet investigation progressed. He connected the 4 deaths: Ramirez, Silva, and the 2 brothers. They all had a connection, however tenuous, to the Los Lobos cartel, and they were all somehow linked to his most frustrating cold case, the murder of the Jalisco family. He couldn't prove it, but the absurd hypothesis was becoming more and more plausible in his mind. The widow, the survivor, the now councilwoman who spoke so vehemently against crime. He began to watch my public activities, looking for something, anything, that would confirm the insane theory blooming in his tired mind. In an act that would define his position in this game, Miguel found a security recording from an alley that showed a disguised woman who looked like me, leaving the gambling club minutes before the brothers killed each other. The image was grainy, inconclusive, but for him it was enough. Instead of logging the tape as evidence, he took it home and burned it. In that moment, He stopped being a police officer seeking the truth and became a silent accomplice. He saw in me a form of justice that the corrupt system he served could never deliver. His help was subtle, an invisible shield that would protect me, at least for now, from the eyes of the law. The pressure began to become overwhelming. I was living three lives, the rising politician by day, the obsessive strategist by night, and the hunter in the shadows. Sleep became a rare luxury, and paranoia a constant companion. Every siren on the street, every lingering stare from a stranger, every call from an unknown number sent a wave of cold adrenaline through my veins. I was juggling too many plates, and I knew that at any moment one of them could fall and shatter my entire plan. The facade of calm and control was beginning to crack from the inside, even if no one on the surface could see it. The next targets, numbers 5 and 6 on my list, were high-ranking figures within the cartel's hierarchy. One was responsible for logistics, the other for finances. They were smarter, better protected. To get to them, I needed them to come to me. I orchestrated an anonymous leak to the federal police, detailing a large drug shipment arriving at the port. But I altered the details to make it look like one target was betraying the other to keep the profits. The disinformation created an internal conflict at the top of the chain of command, just as I had predicted. The trap was set. The fake leak led to an ambush, not by the police, but between the cartel's own factions. In an abandoned warehouse on the docks, the distrust I had planted blossomed into explosive violence. The shootout was intense, an internal war that left both my targets and several of their men dead. The police arrived later, finding only the aftermath of a bloody power struggle. I watched the news on television, my face impassive, as the reporter spoke of the internal war weakening the Los Lobos cartel. They didn't know the war wasn't internal. It had a name, and she was sitting in her living room. This carnage, however, confirmed all of El Sombra's suspicions. This was not the work of traitors or cops. It was the work of an external enemy, someone with intimate knowledge of their operations, someone intelligent, patient, and invisible. His focus narrowed dramatically. Who would benefit from the chaos? Who had a motive strong enough for such a personal war? He went back to the old files, not the police's, but the cartel's memory. And then he remembered the professor, the journalist's wife, the woman they left alive. His eyes turned to the most prominent and unexpected political figure in the city, Councilwoman Claudia Jalisco. El Sombra's certainty made him careless. He sent 2 of his men to watch my apartment, to look for any proof of my double life. I felt them before I even saw them, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, the feeling of being watched. On a rainy night, I lured them into a narrow alley, using my knowledge of the city to my advantage. The confrontation was fast and brutal. It wasn't a clean, distant murder. It was dirty, physical, a desperate fight for survival. I used surprise and the environment to my advantage, incapacitating one and forcing the other to flee. I escaped by a hair's breadth, my heart hammering against my ribs, knowing the game of shadows was over. He knew who I was. Now, only one name remained on the list, the most important one, El Sombra, the architect of my pain, the man whose expressionless face haunted every waking moment. All the other deaths were just the prelude, the steps that led me to him. The revenge would not be complete until he stood before me. The fear of exposure mingled with a grim anticipation. The cat-and-mouse game was over, and the final confrontation was inevitable. I knew he would come for me, and I would be waiting. The board was set for the final move, and I would use the very scene of my greatest trauma as the final trap. The final trap was set at the epicenter of my pain, my old house. Returning to that place was like walking on my own grave. The air was heavy, stale with dust and shattered memories. Every creak of the floorboards was an echo of a life that no longer existed. But there was no time for grief. With surgical precision, I turned the desecrated sanctuary into a battlefield. I used the wreckage of my happiness as weapons. A nearly invisible nylon thread was stretched at the base of the stairs, connected to a pile of old cans. At the door of my daughter's room, I positioned a broken mirror at an angle that would reflect any light, disorienting whoever entered. I sent him an anonymous message, a simple address and a time. I knew his arrogance would bring him alone. El Sombra arrived punctually, moving with the arrogance of a wolf cornering its prey, unaware he was walking into the cage. He circled the house with predatory efficiency before forcing the back door, the metal groaning in protest. He stepped into the darkness, his silhouette framed against the pale moonlight, and the stillness of the house enveloped him. I could see him from the shadows upstairs, his senses sharp, analyzing the environment. He expected to find me hiding, trembling with fear. He saw the dust, the furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts, and felt the contempt of a conqueror returning to a ravaged land. He felt no danger, for he believed he was the only danger in that place. Then my voice broke the silence. Not a scream, but a whisper that seemed to come from all the walls at once. "Do you remember this house, murderer?" I began to speak about my daughter, describing her love of books and the sound of her laughter as she did her homework in the very dining room where he now stood. I spoke of my husband, of how he believed the truth could change the world. I used his real name, a name his own mother had given him before he became a monster, and I repeated it like a mantra. With every word, I stripped away his armor of the merciless sicario, forcing him to confront the man behind the spectre. His posture changed, anger replacing confidence. He yelled for me to show myself, but I remained just a voice, the ghost of the family he had destroyed. Enraged, he stormed up the stairs, his weapon drawn. He kicked open my daughter's bedroom door, and my plan worked. The light from his flashlight bounced off the broken mirror, blinding him for a precious instant. In the same moment, I attacked. I emerged from an adjacent closet, not with a firearm, but with an iron crowbar. The first blow struck his arm, making him drop his weapon. The fight was short and savage. He was stronger, but I was driven by a desperation and a hatred he could not match. I managed to land another blow on his leg before he shoved me hard, sending me to the floor. Before he could recover, I had already retreated into the darkness of the hallway, my heart pounding uncontrollably. The power dynamic shifted instantly. He was no longer the hunter. He was wounded in an environment I knew like the back of my hand, and his prey had bared its fangs. The house became my ally. The cat-and-mouse game was reversed. As he limped through the corridors, cursing and bleeding, I moved silently through the walls, using passages only a resident would know. I tormented him with sounds, a deliberate creak in the attic, a faucet suddenly turning on in the bathroom. My voice continued to haunt him, now listing the names of the other 6 men he had seen die, making him understand that their deaths were not accidents, but chapters in a revenge that would culminate with him. The final confrontation happened where it was meant to, in the living room, on the same wooden floorboards that had soaked up my family's blood. I lured him there, leaving an obvious trail. When he entered, I attacked him from behind. The fight was primal, devoid of any technique. It was a whirlwind of punches, scratches, and pain. He managed to grab me, his superior strength nearly crushing the life out of me, but my hand found a shard of glass from a broken picture frame on the floor. With all the strength I had left, I drove it into his side. He screamed, his grip loosening, and I used the opportunity to grab my husband's heavy journalism trophy from the fireplace and strike him on the head, bringing him to his knees. Defeated, gasping and bleeding on the floor, he looked at me with hatred. He expected the end, a mercy kill. But my revenge was not about his death. It was about his destruction. I took out my wallet and pulled out the only photo I kept, a crumpled portrait of my family, smiling on a sunny day. I knelt in front of him, forced his head up, and held the photo before his blurring eyes. "Look at them!" I hissed, my voice thick with a pain that had turned to poison. "Remember them?" As he stared at the happy faces, I narrated their final moments, the terror in their eyes, their last words. The light in his eyes faded not from the fatal wound I inflicted next, but from the crushing weight of finally having to face the humanity he had annihilated. When El Sombra's last breath dissipated into the dusty air of the room, a deep, heavy silence fell. Silence I had longed for, the silence I believed would bring me peace. But there was no peace. The torrent of adrenaline and hatred that had sustained me for years drained away, leaving behind a desolate void. I looked at my hands, at the blood that stained them, and I felt no triumph, no relief, no justice. I felt only an immense emptiness, an absence of purpose. The 7 names in my notebook were crossed out. The revenge was complete, but the pain in my soul remained, an incurable wound. The ghosts of my family did not smile down on me in gratitude. They remained silent echoes in a house now desecrated by one more death. Before the first ray of sunlight breached the horizon, I acted one last time with the same cold precision that had guided my steps. I erased my tracks, cleaned the blood, and in a final act of both purification and destruction, I set the house on fire. I stood outside for a moment, watching the flames consume the past, the wood groaning like a wounded animal. It was a funeral pyre for the professor, the journalist, the teenager full of dreams, and for the woman who became a monster to hunt other monsters. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. At a roadside diner miles away, I drafted my letter of resignation and sent it. The public persona of Claudia Jalisco had served her purpose, and now she too had to die. The news shook Puerta de Sombras. The promising councilwoman had vanished without a trace, and the charred body of a notorious sicario was found in the rubble of a burned-down house. Theories were rampant, but the truth was too inconceivable for anyone to consider. Only Detective Miguel, as he read the reports, understood the terrible symmetry of it all. He saw the poetic and brutal justice that had been carried out. In his last official act before retirement, he closed both cases, citing inconclusive evidence and probable gang violence. He buried my secret, becoming the silent guardian of a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his days, a grim testament to the failure of the system he had sworn to serve. The years passed. The power vacuum left by Los Lobos did not give way to peace, but to a new generation of predators. My revenge did not heal the city. It was merely a violent spasm in its long history of corruption and pain. Was justice served? I ask myself that every day, from wherever I am. I eliminated 7 monsters, but to do so, I had to become the 8th. I traded my soul for retribution, and now I live in a self-imposed purgatory, neither alive nor dead, just a shadow, haunted by other shadows. The story of Claudia Jalisco became an urban legend in Puerta de Sombras, a tale of a woman who went too far, leaving behind the eternal question, what is the true price of revenge? And now my confession comes to an end. I don't know if I seek absolution or just a listening ear. What I know is that in the end, I did not find redemption. I only found the end of a blood-stained road. The void left by my family's death will never be filled. I thank you for staying with me, for walking this dark path by my side, and for bearing witness to my story. If you haven't already, I ask you one last time to subscribe. Doing so ensures that accounts like mine, born of pain and darkness, continue to be heard, serving as a reminder that behind every desperate act, there is a human story, begging not to be forgotten.